to welcome 4 astronauts, 3 American astronauts and 1 French astronaut. So, thank you to be here, gentlemen. Really, that's a pleasure for me, for us, to have here in the Paris Air Lab, in the Salon du Bourget. So, thank you to come in Paris. So, in your right, so we have Charles Duke from Apollo 16, who walked on the moon. I think you can applaud. Worden, who came 2 years ago from Apollo 15. And Walter Cunnigham from Apollo 7. And of course, Jean-François Clairvoy, who has done three flights in space. So yes, you can applaud him too. Jean-François, if you want to say a few words.
I feel like a kid in front of those guys because I've been dreaming my whole life to do the same thing. And even today, I look like you as, extraterrestrial, more extraterrestrial than me. You know, like people look at me as an extraterrestrial, but for us, low Earth orbit space shuttle, not involved in an incredible program. I mean, testing the lunar module and, going so far that you might have felt that you were leaving Earth for good. But we will ask questions about this soon.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Cunningham, Apollo 7. So what was your mission and how did it go? What did you do?
I'm supposed to remember what my mission was?
And I want the truth.
First, I would like to say how impressive it is to see the crowd of people that are interested like this. I can't get past it. A couple times we've had meetings, and I'm amazed at how many of you are out there. That's one thing. The other thing is about my mission, you asked me. And the older I get, I think I'm more impressed than I was at the mission. I've done a lot of other things in my life since that time, but I'm realizing more and more about it. I'm also one of those people that thinks that 500 years from now, there's only going to be one thing that they remember about Apollo, and that's that man landed on the moon. That'll be it. And people have no idea how hard it was, for example, to get the first Apollo mission off. Apollo 7 was the 5th mission that Wally Schraub, Don Isley, and I were on, and finally we flew in Apollo. So our job was testing the spacecraft. It went almost 12 days, I think, at the time. But to this day, it's almost 51 years later, and Apollo 7 is still the longest, most ambitious, the most successful first test flight of any new flying machine ever. And I'm really glad that I had a role in that.
I have a question for you, Walter, because when, for the first time, a crew flies a new spaceship, it was the first flight with the crew. It's the risk, after the fact, we know the risk was high. How did you discuss among yourself and with management and the designers about accepting the risk, which was known at the time higher than today?
It's interesting, and I will answer that question. But at the time that we were assigned to that, everybody, we had like 30 people, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, the first 3 groups that had been selected. And we all were competitive, all trying to get the next mission, whatever it was. And as I mentioned, it took like 3 attempts to get there in Apollo 7. But I don't think that the people very often today believe me when I tell them that we didn't spend our time. I can assure you this. We did not spend our time focusing on risk. We'd all been fighter pilots. We all knew that there are things that you could do could kill you. But the reason that we became successful fighter pilots, one of the main reasons, is we always felt that we could do whatever we had to do. And when it came to the Mercury mission, I can't even remember when we finally got to launch. And we'd been training as a crew for at least 3 years, starting with a contractor and other places like that. I don't remember that any one of the three of us had any public concern about being afraid or scared at the time, because we all were going to do whatever it took to be successful.
Just a comment about that. That was a good question. I would say that the best time to fly an airplane or a spacecraft is just after you've had an accident, because the results or the aftermath of an accident is that everybody looks at everything 5 different ways than they would have before. The complacency is gone. Everybody makes sure that everything is in place and is going to work the way it is. So I would think that the best time to fly is after you've had an accident. That the very next flight would be the best one, before anybody gets complacent.
And we got that.
You spent 11 days in orbit, is that right? 11 days
Even what?
in orbit?
In orbit. Well, in orbit, we were anxious to do whatever needed to be done, because you never know if there's something going to happen that cause you shorten the flight. But we always thought that we could do it. And I don't think that was unique to our crew. It's just the way we felt about it. And during countdown and lunch, you know what ticked us off? One thing ticked us off on the countdown. We were supposed to lift off, what was it, 11 o'clock, I think. And we're about 7 minutes before liftoff, and they wanted to, they had to stop the count because we had to increase the pressure in one tank by about a pound or a pound and a half. And I'll never forget the fact that irritated us. And Wally Schirra, he publicly put a statement out on it because it made us 2.5 minutes late on liftoff.
Wow. At Worden, you went on the Apollo 15 mission. So what were the goals of the Apollo 15 missions, and how did it go?
Okay. First, may I ask the audience a question? How many people were here 2 years ago? See, I don't want to repeat myself.
It's on
Okay.
YouTube anyway.
Apollo 15 was the 4th manned landing mission. It represented an upgrade in the entire system that we sent to the moon. We had a launch vehicle that was upgraded. We carried a little bit more fuel. We carried the first Lunar Rover, and we carried the scientific instrument module into lunar orbit. And Charlie had the pleasure of flying right after me, doing the same thing. But Apollo 15 was the first of the J missions, and so we had a lot of things that we had to organize and make sure they worked. Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, who flew with me, landed the lunar module in an area called Hadley Rill, which was a rather risky landing site. All of the landings before Apollo 15 had gone into a range of plus or minus 10 degrees from the lunar equator because we knew the gravitational constants there. We landed at Hadley Rill, which is 27 degrees north of the lunar equator, and we weren't sure of the gravitational constants up there, what we call the mass cons, or mass concentrations, which change the local gravity as you go over the surface. And as a matter of fact, we found that it did change our trajectory, and we got very close to the surface. In fact, our trajectory over the landing site dropped down a little bit each night until we were something like 9,000 or 10,000 feet over the top of a mountain that was just to the west of the landing site. So we had to kind of move quickly, I guess, at that. Dave and Jim, on the lunar surface, had a Lunar Rover which, as you know, is a little electric car that they drove to give them extended mobility. One of the ground rules was that you could not get, if you're walking, you couldn't get further away from, correct me if I'm wrong, you couldn't get further away from the lunar module than your emergency oxygen supply would keep you alive to get back. So that meant that the radius of action around the lunar module was pretty restricted. With a rover, you could go a lot further out, and you guys really went a long ways out. In orbit, I had a scientific instrument module. I had two large cameras. One was a very high resolution called a ball opticon camera. It was a camera that was developed in the late 50s for a spy plane that we had in the States called a U-2, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, but this was the camera that was developed for the U-2 program back in the late 50s. The Air Force had a new camera that they were going to use, and so they declared that camera obsolete, and we were allowed to carry it. It was probably the last of the film-type cameras. I'm sure the one they replaced it with was a digital camera. But we also carried a small mapping camera and a set of remote sensors that we used to scan the lunar surface. And the purpose of that was that when we brought the rocks back up, we analyzed the rocks, compared that with the remote sensing that we got from the surface. Then we could develop a software program that would allow us to identify the chemical composition of the surface of any material, of any planet that we're flying over, do it remotely and not have to land anymore. We were also, at the time, I think you beat the record, but I think we had the longest stay time on the lunar surface. You were a little more, right? On the surface at the time. We were gone almost 13 days, spent 6 days in lunar orbit, 75 revolutions, once every 2 hours. I saw the Earth rise 75 times, and I'll tell you what, everybody should see that because it's a wonderful sight. But that was the flight, and it was a rather successful flight.
And you did an EVA.
Oh, I forgot.
No.
Yeah, I did a spacewalk
Yeah.
on the way home. Because we had film in the cameras, and they were outside in an open bay back in the service module, we had to recover that film. And the way to do that is we had to go get it and take it inside the command module, because the only thing that survived the flight is what's inside the command module. It's the only thing that's got a heat shield. So I had to go out and get the film and bring it back in. I made a couple of trips out. I went out a third time and stood up on the outside of the service module for a while, just looked around. And it was quite a sight because I could see both the Earth and the Moon just by turning my head a little bit. Great spot to be.
And when you are on EVA on the way back to the Earth, you are still far from the Earth and the Moon. How do you feel, like almost in the middle of nowhere as opposed to spacewalk around the ISS? How do you compare when you look at what we do now around the ISS? You know, a lot of spacewalks, very close to the Earth.
It's interesting. You know, Jean-Francois, I had practiced that thing so much that I didn't really think about it much. And I think we all do that. You get so much practice that when you do the real thing, you do it by what I call rote. You just kind of do it. It's like, to me, it's like playing a piano, which I used to do. You practice 5 days a week and give a concert on Saturday, but when you give the concert, you're not afraid because you've done it so many times. And I think football players, they beat themselves silly 5 days out of the week so they can be on television for 3 hours on Saturday afternoon. Spaceflight's kind of the same way. Once you've gone through all that training, you don't really think about it very much when you're there. And my spacewalk was kind of like the same thing. I wrote a little ditty about it one time. It's sort of like doing a spacewalk by being let out at night by Moby Dick for a swim. And that's kind of the way it is. This big white spacecraft, and you're floating around outside of it. And I could think of Moby Dick and floating along with him. And that's kind of what it was like.
It reminds me Claude Nicollier on the mission to the Hubble Space Telescope. When he came back from the spacewalk, he felt it was like back, like in training.
Yeah.
And he forgot he was in space doing the work. But you know, you are a big joker. You like jokes. Can you tell us a joke about the Apollo missions? I mean, you probably have a lot of jokes among yourself. Is there any joke you think of nothing to do with your mission specifically, but or when your friend
Well,
comes
I could tell you one thing. On Apollo 12, Pete Conrad was the commander, Dick Gordon was the CMP, and Alan Bean was the LMP. And they were jokesters. So we fixed up Pete Conrad's checklist on the lunar surface with pictures of almost naked ladies. So he had on the lunar surface Playboy bunnies in his checklist to look at while he was on the lunar surface. We also, we had to think up, you know, Neil Armstrong said, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, Pete Conrad's like this tall. So we had to figure out something for Pete Conrad to say too. And all we could come up with was, that might have been one small step for Neil, but it was a huge leap for me, because Pete's about this high. He had to make a big jump to get down.
I got, on our way back from our flight, we got an EVA to collect the same cameras, and Ken Mattingly floated out, did Al's job. Well, I guess Jim Irwin did my job, and what we did was float out, hook our feet in the side of the hatch and just monitor their work. Well, I'm out there and I said, where's the Earth? And I looked down over here and there was the Earth, just a little thin sliver of blue and white. And it was 180,000 miles away down there. And, well, where's the moon? And I turned around and up here was this enormous full moon about 50,000 miles away. And it just looked like it was overwhelming. You know, you were so busy you probably didn't get a chance to look at it, but that's all I did was look at these beautiful objects. And the sun was up here and everywhere else was the blackest black you could ever see. And space is black.
And I'm sure you don't have the feeling of moving, because in low Earth orbit we have a sense of velocity.
Yeah.
But in the middle like this, you are just...
We were probably traveling through space maybe 6,000 kilometers an hour, but you don't feel like you're moving. Nothing changes here, nothing changes there over, you're outside just an hour or so. So you don't sense that rapid movement across the Earth. It was spectacular.
So Apollo 16 took place in 72. You were the youngest man to walk on the moon. You were 36.
That's correct. I was 36, and now I'm 83, and I'm still the youngest man that walked on the moon.
Yeah.
And that'll never change.
But that's going to change, I think, real soon.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I think we're going to go back to the moon. Hopefully next decade. Depends on the budgets and depends on the appropriations. The money is the driver, I believe, not the technology. It's going to be the money.
Okay, before we talk about the future, we talk about the future, let's talk about your mission. What did you feel when you first walked on the moon, when you arrived on the moon surface?
Well, it was exciting for several reasons. One, we were 6 hours late landing. 1 hour before we were to land on the moon, we were on the far side of the moon, and Mattingly had to change his orbit in the command module from 60 miles by 170, 60 miles by 60 circular. Well, anyway, we were 60 by 8 miles, and he had to change his orbit. Well, as he started to test out the engine, the service module engine, one of the control systems was out. So he said it feels like it is shaking the spacecraft apart. And John Young, the commander, says, don't burn. Well, when he said that, we were not going to land the next hour on the front side of the moon. So we'd come, it was a big disappointment. We'd come, trained for 2 years, come all the way to the moon. My landing site's down there 8 miles away, and they're telling me to come home. You can imagine the feeling we had in the lunar module. But Mission Control saved the day. It took them 4 hours to figure out what was wrong. They couldn't fix it, but they got a workaround, we call it, so we could get around that problem. And so they gave us a go for landing. So 6 hours late, we landed. And of course, when we touched down, I believe I shouted to Mission Control, old Orion, our call sign was Orion. Old Orion is finally here, Houston, fantastic. And so we were very excited, of course. And we're like two little kids at Christmas and birthday, you know, in a candy store. You're looking out at this incredible lunar surface. And but the most amazing thing about it, I felt right at home. I could look out John's window, and there was Stone Mountain. I could look out my window, and there were we call it the Smoky Mountains over there. So we recognized all of these major features that we had been 2 years training to explore. So you felt, well, I'm home. I know where to go. I know what's over here. So it was a feeling of belonging. But it was also wonder, awe, excitement, adventure. Best way I could describe it, if you could imagine a 5-year-old kid on Christmas and birthday and everything else rolled into one, that was the most exciting moment in my life. It was just an incredible experience. And we never lost that enthusiasm and that excitement about being on the moon. We were there almost 72 hours and had 3 rest periods, so 3 excursions, and we were the second with a car, and so we were able to explore, and the car would go 100 kilometers and back, but you didn't drive that far, because if you drove out 10 kilometers and the car broke down, you had to walk back. So our limit was not our emergency system, but the oxygen and the cooling water in our life support system. So the object was to drive out as far as we thought we could walk back and start there and work back. And so if the car broke down out there, you could walk back. And we got more and more confident with the car. And so on Apollo, I think we were like 6 kilometers maximum away, but on Apollo 17, they were almost 10 kilometers away. So we got confidence in the car, and so we took more chances to go out and come back.
I got a question for you. And I bet you know what I'm going to ask. Yeah, you will, very quickly. On Apollo 15, the 2 guys that I flew with had heart anomalies when they came back up off the surface. In fact, there was a lot of discussion about even doing an extravehicular activity, lowering the pressure in the spacecraft to 0 because of the heart problems, particularly that Jim Irwin had. And it was finally decided by the doctors that their problem was that they had lost, through dehydration, too much potassium. Because potassium ion, are you with me now? Okay. Because potassium ion is the electrical mechanism for making the heartbeat. So what they did is they fortified the fruit juice that Apollo 16 had. And I'm going to let Charlie explain what happened.
Well, so we had this potassium in all the food was laced with potassium, and so when we got airborne, as we started eating this food, we didn't have any heartbeats, but the potassium gave us a lot of bowel movements, and we were just going to using the waste management system every day, and we were running out of bags. And but it was a terrible situation, actually. And so we're in our spacesuits and waiting to land. And I've got this gallon of orange juice with this potassium inside my spacesuit, and every time I breathed, out came a little drop of orange juice that then floated around inside the helmet. And I tried to suck it in, you know, and lick it up, but it wasn't working. It was getting all in my hair and on the visor and everything. And also, it gave you a lot of gas, and so John Young said, well, I got him again, if you can know what he's talking about. And so he starts, we thought we were talking to ourselves, but we were talking to Houston. And John and I, we start cussing out this orange juice. And finally, Houston broke through and said, guys, you better watch it. You're talking to the whole world. And we thought we were just, you know, letting this orange juice have it in lunar orbit. So we had a lot of problems with potassium, but we didn't have any problem with the heart on the lunar surface. It worked, and except for the bowel movements in space, we probably hold the record for 12 days. And I don't know whether you know what the waste management system looked like in Apollo, but it was not a triumph of technology, believe me.
Charlie, you know, your trip on the moon was not just a few hours. You slept, you woke up on the moon, you spent several days. You were a resident of the moon. Is it a regime that you could have prolongated many days? How was it to be a resident? Was it still very uncomfortable, or like a camping trip? Or you felt, I am a citizen of the moon for several days, and it could have been a week or several weeks?
I think you get used to it. It's a very confining situation. We landed, and we were 6 hours late landing, and so our flight plan originally called us for putting our backpacks on and going out and explore about 6 hours later after landing. We powered down the spacecraft, but Mission Control decided since you were late landing, you're going to have the day too long and you could get tired and you'd make a mistake. So they decided that we would go to sleep first. So we took off our spacesuits, we had some debriefing, we ate a meal, and we strung up a hammock, 2 hammocks, and mine was from right to left, right off the floor, and John's was forward to aft, about a meter above me. And so we slept in the hammocks. We'd eaten a meal, and I think we could have gone for a week like that. It wasn't, it was very comfortable. You're 1/6 gravity. You've taken your suit off, and we didn't have any seats in the lunar module, so you just sort of leaned against something. You didn't get tired, except working outside. That was very hard work in a lunar suit. So we had 72 hours, basically, and we split it up into 3 24-hour days. We'd wake up, we'd eat a meal, we'd debrief or a brief about the EVA, then we'd suit up, go outside and explore, come back inside, and take off our suits, clean up the suits. The only problem is we tracked in a lot of moon dust. But fortunately, in in weight, it stayed on the floor, and so it didn't swirl around the spacecraft. But in the future, I believe you're going to need an airlock on the moon, because if you track moon dust into your habitation module for 2 months, you're going to have a real problem. And so we need to have a habitation module, and but John and I were so excited and having such a fun time, we didn't want to come back. But we were running out of stuff, oxygen and electrical power. So they made us come back. But it was something I think I could have stayed at least a week.
Did you get some bonus points as hotel awards for going back? And I have a scoop. For his anniversary in October, Charlie will walk under real moon gravity for the first time since he left the moon on board the Air Zero G plane.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Wow.
that was in our visit to Tahiti. Yeah.
And
Well-
you not only lived and walked on the moon, you also fell down on the surface. What was the feeling of the lunar gravity when you fell down?
Well, if you fell forward, it wasn't a problem, which I did several times. It was easy to lose your balance up on the moon because you're uneven surface. You got this basically clumsy spacesuit, and when you fall down, you just do a series of push-ups. It took me 3 push-ups to get up, and so you're up. The problem was if you fell on your back.
Did you?
I did, and that was the only time I really had fear in the flight. We were going to set the high jump record on the moon. The Moon Olympics kicked off the Munich Olympics in 1972. So we did the Moon Olympics, and I jumped. When I did, I was about maybe 3 or 4 feet, over a meter off the moon, unfortunately going over backwards. And so I'm falling, and the life support system, or the backpack we call it, was very fragile. And if you fell and it broke, you're dead. So I had to roll right, broke my fall, and I was flat on my back, and my heart was pounding. And John Young, my commander, looked down and said, "That wasn't very smart, Charlie." And he said, get me up. He helped me up, and so I could hear the pumps running. The pressure was normal. I began to calm down. Then I looked up, and the TV camera was pointed right at me. And my wife, Dorothy, was in mission control in the viewing area, and she said they were really upset with you guys. And that ended the Moon Olympics. By the way...
But who won? Did you win the Moon Olympics?
I was the only one that tried, so yeah, I got the record.
I thought your commander.
By the
would
way,
try
my wife Dorothy's here, and so is Dot Cunningham. Hi, Daryl.
So we talked about the past. Let's talk about the future. If you had all the money you wanted, what would you do for the moon? What would you do if you wanted to go back on the moon? What kind of, I don't know, mission, rockets, base, I don't know. What do you want to go? Maybe.
The question again?
Yeah.
What would you do on the moon if a future mission? If you had unlimited budget.
Well, if I was on the future and they had on the moon in the future and they had a problem, I would be glad as hell that I was able to be there and experience it. I remember when I joined NASA, I wanted to do 3 things. I wanted to fly in space, I wanted to be on the moon, and I wanted to command a flight. And the only thing that I ever accomplished was the first one, to fly in space. And I believe that with you got your training, that the landing on the moon, except for right down the last 30 seconds, I think it was all fairly straightforward. I mean, after you develop the skills. But when you're having to make a landing under those kinds of circumstances and you're running out of fuel, even though you expect to run out of fuel and you're trained to do it, I think that can be a little bit tight. But I envy my astronaut friends that got to actually land on the moon. He came close, but he decided he was going to stay up and do it.
Thank you. What would you do?
Not sure I'd do anything at the moon. We're talking about having all the money we need to do something.
Yes.
I would put all that money into building the first warp drive.
Ready?
I think that human beings, in fact, it was interesting talking to Thomas a little while ago. He's got a crew patch that says Proxima. Well, Proxima B is the nearest Earth-like planet that we could live on, probably. We don't know yet, but it looks like it. But it's 4.2 light years away, which means at our current speeds, we could get there in about 40,000 years, okay? So I'm saying, if I had all the money in the world, I would put it all on developing a warp drive, because we cannot afford to take 40,000 years to get someplace. We need to get there a little quicker than that. And I do believe it's possible. I do believe we can build something that would push us past the speed of light, and that we could go to places. I do not think Star Trek, it may be science fiction, but I think it's going to become science fact. I'm a firm believer in science fiction leads the way to the things that we do. And you can look at Jules Verne's book that he wrote back in the 1800s, and it's a perfect analogy to what we did in Apollo. 3 guys go to the moon, they go around the moon, they come back, they land in the ocean under parachutes, and where was their launch site? Anybody know? Kennedy Space Center, just west. He picked Cape Canaveral as a launch site, well, at that latitude. They were actually about 20 miles inland, as his launch site in 1868. Amazing. So anyway, I say, maybe somebody read that book. That's why we picked Cape Kennedy to launch. Maybe that's why we put 3 men in a spacecraft instead of some other number. Maybe that's why we went around the moon in that spacecraft. Maybe that's why we came back and landed in the ocean under parachute, because he wrote about it in 1868. Or did he write about something that was so close to being the optimum way of doing something that that was a no-brainer, that we were just going to do it that way? Anyway, I think it's fascinating. And I do believe we could probably go faster than the speed of light if we really put all of our minds to it and had lots and lots of money. And I think that's the next thing we should be doing.
Okay, so exoplanets instead of moon or Mars.
Well, I think to me, I will never get to go to an exoplanet, but I'd love to go back to the moon. And if we have a unlimited budget, as you asked the question, I think we would build a habitation module. We would erect several telescopes on the moon, infrared experiments. We'd start to do manufacturing techniques, develop those on the moon, and maybe we could learn to extract the water, the oxygen, the hydrogen. We would land probably on near the polar region, because the temperatures are not as extreme. But we would have a base that I would call, like in Antarctica, that we would have it permanently manned, people traveling back and forth to the moon. We would have a bigger habitation module with an airlock, and we would just do a whole suite of experiments like they're doing in Antarctica today. There's a lot to learn, to develop the systems that we need to go to Mars, and with systems that last and they can be repairable. And all of that you develop at the moon, and then you take that technology already developed with confidence to Mars, because once you launch to Mars or to an exoplanet, you're on your own. There's no resupply, no hardly any help from Houston. You basically have to learn how to fix it, repair it, and replace it.
Jean-François?
I'm surprised nobody said that. If I were given all the money to go to first, I would try to beat Charlie's record, Olympic record first. Then I would like to go on the far side.
Yes.
To experience what it feels like to not see the Earth in the long run. It must be strange for a human being. I mean, it has never been done before, except for a few minutes, 20 minutes or behind the moon. But living without seeing your home planet for a long time, I think has probably a strong impact. We need to understand before we go to Mars.
Al, you experiment this, not seeing the Earth during a few minutes. That's something you experimented.
45 minutes, right, in every orbit on the far side?
When you were on the far
Oh,
side
oh,
of the moon,
how-
you didn't see the Earth.
Every time you go behind, yeah.
It's a little less than an hour around the backside. A complete orbit around the moon is 2 hours, as opposed to here around the Earth where it's an hour and a half. And that's simply because of the gravitational attraction of the moon is so much less that you don't have to go fast to stay in orbit. So it's 2 hours. So it's a little less than an hour and 50 minutes, 55 minutes, something like that, before you come around. You don't have to make a complete 180 to be in contact with mission control. It's a little less than that. But yeah, about 45 minutes on the backside.
And it's rough back there. The part we saw was it would be the eastern side of the backside. When we landed, we were about a half moon in the sky, so that meant that half the backside was in sunlight, and the part I saw was really, really rough. To find a suitable landing spot back there, I think would be really tough.
Kind of an interesting bit following on what Charlie said. All the flights landed when the moon was about half, because you want like a 3-degree sun angle at the landing site, so the sun is just coming up, which meant that if you're on the back side of the moon, it's half lit. If you're on the front side, it's half lit. If you're on the east or west of the moon, it's either full lit or dark. There are two sources of light in lunar orbit. One is direct sunlight, and the other is reflection of sunlight off the Earth, which we call albedo. Now, because of the situation of the moon, where it's only half in sunlight, and we're going to land sort of on that line, that means that 1/4 of each revolution is shadowed from both the sun and the Earth. That to me was the big thing that I got on my flight. Looking back at the Earth and watching it rise was magnificent, but looking at the universe out there was something totally different, something totally enormous. I couldn't imagine it because I lost sight of individual stars.
Oh.
There's so many stars that you can see from out there, like 1,000,000 times as many stars as you can see through the atmosphere. Just a wash of light out there, and it makes you wonder what we could see if we could get a big telescope up there, or there are lots of things we could do. But that triggered me to start thinking about the universe. And I don't know how many people understand where we are, but we're a part of the Milky Way. We're about 1/3 of the way out on an arm of the Milky Way galaxy. And I am shocked when I hear the numbers of stars in the Milky Way, because it's unbelievable. There are 400 billion stars in our own little galaxy. And the Hubble telescope and all the other telescopes we got up there indicate to us today that there are like 200 billion galaxies in the universe we can see. That tells me there's an Earth out there somewhere that'll sustain life. Got to be.
Mr. Cunningham?
Well, I might add a few comments. This is the first time I heard a couple of friends of mine describe so many things that was a hell of a lot better than what we had in Earth orbit. And we were working to get them that. For example, you just talk about communications. Good or bad, they were essentially in complete communications with the Earth. Actually, we were better off because we didn't have to put up with the ground that much. We had air-to-ground communications about 4.5% of the time. And occasionally that would interfere with what we were doing because we were testing the spacecraft. And I can remember when occasionally there'd be a remark back and forth between us because we had to put up with some more communications when we were busy trying to test the spacecraft. We also, when we were in Earth orbit, we had about every hour and a half, we had 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes of daylight. Our spacecraft was always drifting, and if you look at the atmosphere, you find that a very tiny percentage of the time is your spacecraft pointing at the Earth, and we had a total of 540 pictures we could take of it. And we had to stretch that a little bit right at the end, but you're not looking at the ground very much. If you're looking at the ground, you're traveling around the Earth. Every 45 minutes, of course, you got darkness. You can't see much at all on the ground. The 45 minutes that you do have, you might be pointing in, you might be pointing out, but 55% of the time you're pointing someplace else. If you're looking down at the ground, for some reason you had fuel, which we didn't have, to keep it pointed down there, you'd find that 55% of the ground surface is covered with clouds. You can't take a picture of that. So there was all kinds of things like this that people don't even think about. In fact, today, they look at it as a real luxury with what limited capability we had in Earth orbit. And of course, we're still jealous about the guys that got to go out there, but we feel like we had much worse ordinary circumstances than they ever could get to. They were fortunate. All they had to worry about was not making the landing, or if they ran out of fuel, they might have a problem too.
You know, Walter and Charlie, do you sometimes go and visit your own spaceship? Do you know where it is on Earth, which museum, and do you go and touch and the one you came back with?
Ours is in the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, at a part of the Marshall Space Flight Center. And it's on the tip of the Saturn V. It's actually, the Saturn V is hung in this building in sections, and as you pass the command module that is on that spacecraft, which is a module, not a fake, then ours is just to the left in a very special place. And it's been maybe 10 years since I've been there, but we visited it, and they have a really good display. And I recorded a video for them, so you can punch the button and hear my voice talking about this spacecraft.
Apollo 15 is at the Air Force Museum in Wright-Patt in Dayton, Ohio. It's been there for a long time because, of course, we were all three Air Force guys. And so the Air Force got Apollo 15. I have not seen it since it's been installed there. It's right inside the front door of the space wing of the Air Force Museum, which is probably the largest museum in the country in a way. But I am there virtually all the time because all of my friends who visit the Space Museum take a picture of it and send it to me. So I see it lots and lots and lots, but never been there.
Well, my wife and I, we've seen that spacecraft there a number of occasions. It is a nice display. It took us, it must have been about 30 years after the flight of Apollo 7 that we finally managed to get it turned loose from a Canadian place where they had it, got them to ship it back. So for about 10 years now, we've had it at the Frontiers of Flight Museum in excuse me, in Dallas Love Field. And it's kind of nice to see it every once in a while. You begin to realize what was going on back in those days.
And my last question is, what kind of advice would you give to space agencies or astronauts for first successful mission to Mars?
What would you? I don't understand that. Could you repeat it?
What advice would you give to the astronaut crew that's going to Mars first time?
Keep your hands to yourself.
I think they're going to have to be really focused, and it's a long trip, and you've got to learn to get along with one another, and that was true in Apollo. A lot of different personalities in the crews, but we learned to work with one another, and we learned to get along with one another because of the good of the mission. If you get in a big fight up there, you lose your proficiency, you lose your ability to work together, And so you've got to learn to adapt your personality to fit in with everybody else. And I think emotionally, operationally, everybody can do it. It's going to be the emotional struggles, I think, on a long duration like that, to keep focused on your mission.
Well, it's one thing to talk about returning to Mars today, because the public at large, it's kind of amazed me over the last 10 or 12 years, the public at large has started getting very positive about returning to, taking humans and taking them out to Mars. I'm one of those people that I think I'm being realistic. It's going to be a number of decades longer than we people today talking about going to Mars. Now, why is that? Well, it's going to make a lot of sense to not do it, but there's going to come a time when we're going to do it anyway. But when you go to Mars, you're going to have to find a way to do it at a whole lot better velocity than you've been doing in going to the moon. You're going to have to be able to handle communications that will be taking you, what, maybe 45 minutes sometimes to get the communications back and forth. You won't have enough things to do to occupy your time. So God only knows how the crew will be getting along for that time. The other factor is when we went to the moon, we knew very little about the moon. And we went there anyway. And now they're talking about going back there and establishing a base. It makes a lot of logical sense to do that. When you talk about going to Mars, it'll take a long time before they have that kind of information. Secondly, it's going to cost so much more than it did to go to the moon. And the public support and the governmental support of manned spaceflight has been falling off over the years, unfortunately, but there has to be a good motivation to do it. You have to be able to get the funding. The program to go to Mars, that was a $20 billion program. Actually went over the planned expenditure, and they spent $25 billion to do that. And today, if you converted that cost to our current value of the dollar, you'll find that that's right at close to $150 billion. And believe me, it's going to cost a lot more to develop a few things in the technology you need to go to Mars, and we're not willing to put up that kind of money. Secondly, going to Mars is a reach out. Some people talk about going there to save us from the moon or something hitting the Earth. There won't be, I don't think there'll be anything that we can do to stop that. And I think that right now we've been to Mars, unmanned vehicles, we know over 100 times as much as we knew about the moon when we went to the moon. So we're learning a lot more about it. It's going to be tougher to rationalize humans going to Mars, but we will end up doing it anyways, people sticking their neck out. One of these days. But my recommendation would be don't buy into the fact that we're going to be going there in 5 years and things like that. Not going to happen.
I think the first advice I would give is be involved from the very early stage of the design of the ship and the mission, being involved. Second, live at least once isolation experience before, around the moon, on the moon, in Antarctica, some kind of real isolation. And probably also talk to the senior guys who have been there before, maybe not so long, but really it's quite an engagement from a human perspective. So, but if you make the ship be your own ship, if you are in the design, it's not you and the ship. You are part of the ship and the mission, and that's the most important thing. But and believe strongly in the reason why you do it. because you can't afford to have doubts once you're going.
Worden, another word on Mars, maybe another advice for Mars.
Advice
So-
on Mars.
Advice? Oh, I think it depends on the crew.
Yeah.
I would give advice differently if the crew is all female than if it was all male. My advice would be rather specific if it was a mixed crew. If I was on the crew, I wouldn't have to say anything to anybody because it would be on me anyway. And I happen to think that 3 old guys like us are the ones that should go to Mars first because who cares? We might come back, we might not, but we've lived good lives, and we could spend them very nicely going to Mars, and maybe or maybe not coming back. But I think the secret to being a good crew member on the way to Mars is going to be patience, lots of patience, and lots of perseverance, and not getting dispirited, not becoming despondent because you're locked up in a very small cage over a long period of time. So I think perseverance and patience will win the day for the Mars crew.
Thank you so much for being here, gentlemen. Thank you, really, for coming.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.